Well, hello everybody and welcome to our latest webinar in our series from the Myanmar Hong Kong Chamber of Commerce and Industry. This webinar is part of our series, Preparing Your Business in Myanmar for 2021. And today's topic, as you all know, is Yangon's urban future and critical infrastructure. And I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker today, Mr. Aung Khant, from the Executive Director of Urbanize, which is a local think tank that specialises in urban and regional planning and has been used by a number of agencies such as JICA for the Strategic Urban Development Plan of Greater Yangon. So I think he's extremely well placed for answering questions and for talking to you about the opportunities for future development and infrastructure here in Yangon specifically. As we do this webinar, I will be handing over for Aung Khant to make a presentation shortly. We will then follow that by Q&A, so you have your opportunity to ask questions, which I will come back to you for, as I will be asking the questions to him. There is a Q&A feature on the Zoom, and you find that at the base of the screens that you're operating. And what I would ask you to do is just put your questions into that. We as panelists will be able to view the questions and we will try and answer as many of those questions as we possibly can. So really for me, I will leave you to our guest presenter and I will come back to you at the end of the presentation for the Q&A section. So if I can, I would just now like to introduce our guest presenter to carry on for the next hour or so in terms of doing this. Just remember, please do use the Q&A function for any questions that you may wish to ask, and we will endeavour to answer as many as we possibly can. So I will move across and allow him to present to you now.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Aung Khant, and I'll be giving today the presentation. As you all know, thank you for joining me again. I will share my screen now. I hope you guys can all see this. Great. So before we start off on looking at the urban future of Yangon, we have to start, of course, with a little bit of context. The population in Myanmar, as we all know, is growing, but exponentially so. And according to the data that we have from the last 2014 census, it is currently at 51.5 million, and we are expecting it to be in the ballpark of 60 million before the end of this year. As population is one of the key determinants of any city, Yangon region currently accounts for around between 7 and 7.5 million in the region of Yangon, and around a little bit over 5 in the city itself. The growth of the city is quite remarkable if you look at this graph, because compared to previous censuses from 1973 to 1983, and then to 2014, we've seen a remarkable growth in the city compared to other regions and other states, even so for new cities such as Naypyidaw, which are still quite small in terms of it. Speaking of the population growth, Yangon, as we see on this chart here, is of course also very highly ranked, and perhaps we can say that it is the only large urban metropolis in the country, with secondary cities such as Mandalay trailing behind at a little bit around 2. The projected Yangon population for 2042 is about double that we have of right now. And this is, keep in mind that this is the inner city projection. This does not include the metropolitan area. This is mainly for the inner city. And 2042 is very interesting for us because you will see that later, that Yangon only has a master plan up to 2040. So for the next 20 years. In 20 years, we can say pretty much that the population is expected to double. And so every problem and every infrastructure, especially needs for this population, is to be highly observed. Once we covering a little bit about the history of Yangon, you'll see on this timeline here that the first Rangoon Municipal Act was set up in the colonial government era in 1922. This was pretty much the first administrative body for the city, and the population at that time was only in the tens of thousands. It had not reached the hundreds yet. By U Ne Win's government of 1958, the caretaker government, the municipal commissioner was set up, and by that time, that is the first incarnation of the municipal government that we see today. The current YCDC body was set up on the 14th of May 1990 with the Yangon City Development Law, and that has been largely the same body that we see today with some changes in some departments. Keeping in mind that the original colonial Rangoon Municipal Act duties are still carried out by the YCDC to this day. Now, I mentioned 2014 as an important year because that is the census information that we have, the latest one. And 2016 is also, of course, the start of the new government elected by the people. And that is the first time we see Chief Minister Phyo Min-Thein in office. Many of the changes that have happened in Yangon that we are interested in contemporary times would start from this date naturally. The first being the high-rises ban that was in May 2016, just a few months after his coming into office. Over 200 high-rise construction sites were cancelled or were stopped temporarily following his order. And we all know that from many of our developers joining us today. The next year, in January 2017, was the first time that we saw the consolidation of private bus companies under a public-private partnership led by the Yangon regional government under the body of YBS, or the Yangon bus system. This is also very important for our transportation modes because that largely changed the landscape of Yangon, as in fact, of course, many of you already know. The 31st of March 2018 is also very important for us because that was the first time the new Yangon development project was started to take shape under the NYDC body that you see today, led by the Chief Minister and Regional Minister for Construction, Doni Lacho, and of course, local businessman Serge Pan. Now, this NYDC was indeed proposed during the previous government era under U Tae-sin's government, or U Mien-sui's previous Yangon Chief Minister, but 2018 was very much the date that it started to take shape under its current form. Now, of course, we are in 2020, and we are also going to be looking at the development to be expected in the next 5 years beyond 2020 going onwards. But for the sake of time and for everybody's information, I will be focusing much largely on the projects and the statistics going from 2016. Now, when the Yangon regional government came into office under Phyo Min-Thein in 2016, the development principles were organized as such. Well, the first was, of course, to promote the business of the city and to make it more of an economic hub than it already is, and to follow up on its economic activity. The second, which is very interesting to us, is the 2040 Sustainable Urban Development Plan, or also known as the Yangon Master Plan, that was drawn by JICA originally in 2013. Now, 2013 was, of course, under the previous government, but this was also one of the principles of the Yangon regional government coming into office. The third principle was to address the needs of the population growth, and which is why I mentioned the growth of the population in the previous charts. And fourth was, of course, to also coordinate with the rest of the country, especially the rural areas, both in Yangon region and beyond, and to help them grow parallelly to Yangon city. So once we look at some of the projects that have been done in 2016 onwards, of course, there are quite a few, but for the sake of time and for interest of impact, I have collected some of the biggest, most impactful projects under this sheet, under international cooperation. The first, of course, is our biggest player in Yangon region from the international community. That is, of course, JICA from the Japanese. And the most impactful of it was the Sustainable Urban Development Plan, which was drawn up in 2013. Now, this to this day includes 42 priority projects inside the SUDP, and onwards it also includes the smaller parts of the SUDP, which is plans such as the YUDM for urban development management, And of course, then the Urban Transport Development Plan, UTRA and YUMRT for the mass rapid transit. Now, most of these plans are all descended from the SUDP, and you'll see also other non-related projects, independent projects of itself, such as the Circular Railway Upgrading Project that many of you might have followed. Now we have quite a few number of new train carriages from Japan, second-hand Japans that have been repurposed to work the lines of Yangon. On this upgrading, largely most of it is already complete. One of the advantages of this is that the Yangon Circle line will now have about 1 hour less time than before because of faster speeds, improvements to the track itself, and shorter waiting times and signaling times. Other projects that are also quite interesting for us is the Yangon Mapping Project, which is a very GIS-related mapping project conducted by JICA with the help of many other smaller organizations. The disaster resilience system was, of course, also made by JICA in partner with YCDC. The sewage system is also one that is still being worked on, including the project in Tengbin, which is made by a partnership with Fukuoka City in Japan, which is one of the sister cities with Yangon, and in partnership also with UN Habitat for a solid waste management landfill to be made sanitarily. Now, this does not mean that JICA is the only player. Of course, we have players from Europe as well that are active in Yangon. One of the most important stakeholders and the most visible is, of course, the renovation of the bus stops by a company, a French company of JC Deco, in partnership with FMI, our local company here. The second, going on this bus stops, about 500 bus stops are due to be renovated. As far as the information that I have, until the end of 2019, December, about 350 of those bus stops have already been renovated into the ones that you see today, the ones with the glass and a bit more modern looking ones. Poland has also offered quite a lot of help for a waste-to-energy plant to be built on the outskirts of the city. This has been proposed for quite a while, but the taking of its shape has only started recently, and as far as I know, it has been approved in the Yangon region Luto and is supposed to be starting by the end of the year. The French Development Agency, AFD, also helped with a township zoning pilot project in Line Township for the purposes of zoning and helping with them. This is the first pilot that has been taking place, and a lot of other projects will be following suit expectedly. The government of the city of Paris has also been quite helpful for Yangon, especially in the early years of 2016 and 17, with the help for Minigon Flyover project, as well as the renovation of parks in Jiminine and along the Strand Road that we see today. Other regional players, especially from Southeast Asia and Asia, include, of course, the Thai Amata Smart City project that is to be made in East Dagon. Now, this is a $1 billion project that is led by a Thai development company, real estate development company, to be built in East Dagon. The Koreans have also started to play a bit more in the participation of development of Yangon with a proposed bridge to Dala that is to be built in the coming years, and which is currently ongoing feasibility studies, including a KMIC, or the Korea-Myanmar Industrial Complex project, that will also be taking place in the northeast of Yangon on the way towards Bago on the Yangon-Mandalay Highway. The other developments, of course, also include the Hong Kong and hotels conglomerate with Yoma for the renovation of the Peninsula project that we see next to Bojuk Street and Strand Street, right on the corner where the old Myanmar Railways office stood. Of course, as we are right now on the call with the Hong Kong Chamber, I cannot leave out the central project by Marga Development Group that is taking place along the Kabae. Moving on to local efforts that are led by specifically first the YRG, there is quite a few number of things that I cannot cover in this presentation alone, but for the sake of everyone's interest, the most impactful ones are, of course, the Yangon Metropolitan Development Company that has been set up by Chief Minister Pyo Min-Thein and led by Donnie Dacho as well. The second one is the most impactful and the most visible that we also see, which is the Yangon bus system and the Yangon Regional Transport Authority, the YRTA, that is now taking that now has traffic control systems set up across the city as well. And of course, we have New Yangon Development, which is also set up under the YRG as a Special Companies Act. We also have projects from union ministry levels that have taken place in Yangon, especially from the Ministry of Education for the housing development projects along Parami Road that you see next to the RC2 campus on Parami Road. We have also many housing projects, affordable housing and low-cost housing projects that have been taking place under the Department of Urban Housing Development under the Ministry of Construction. And of course, we have many large impactful projects from local players such as the Yangon Heritage Trust with their Blue Plaque projects and heritage conservation projects, as well as many others. And of course, there are also smaller players that have taken place into cleaning up of the city, such as Doane, that has led many of the popular movements for the cleaning up of back alleys, including heritage renovation for conservation alongside Yangon Heritage. And we have other local players that are more corporate and business-wise, such as the Tilawa Special Economic Zone, which is set up on the southeastern side of Yangon and is due to be growing very soon. And in fact, is named one of the crown jewels in the success as termed so by State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi. Along the private sector, we have many projects that have taken place in the development alongside Kabaye Road, all the way from Lower Kabaye to Upper Kabaye, starting with projects such as 68 residents alongside the Pearl Condo existing area. We have, of course, also the development along the area of Nyama Plaza, where the central project also stands today. Other projects, housing projects especially, have taken place in the development of Oklapa Township in the northeast of the city, and we will be talking a bit more about this as well. Time City is one of the most recent projects that have taken place a bit more in the southern and western side of the city along Kamayut Township. And there have been many markets that have been being upgraded, the two of which are in Tamwe and Mingala right now. And of course, we also have the last Kantaya Consortium that have started a development project and have finished it along the Kandoji area where the current Wyndham Hotel stands today. Some quick facts to recap everyone. I hope I'm not flooding with information, but I hope you all appreciate the nice graphics here as well, which is that many of the accomplishments taking place under the Yangon Regional Government since 2016 is in low-cost housing and infrastructure repairs. And you'll also have noticed, of course, the relocation of street vendors alongside the Strand Road by order of Chief Minister Phyo Min Thein, where the current night market is also thriving. A lot of markets have been upgraded, but they have not been upgraded to the standards that we have expected as much. E-government is one area where the Yangon Regional Government has also taken a keen interest and have pushed out applications such as MyMobi for the success of YBS, so that people can check the status of their buses and their bus routes. Back alleys have been cleaned, including, of course, very visible ones in downtown, and a lot of roads have been paved. But these are very basic doings of YCDC for any government term. So we arrive now at the priorities set by Chief Minister Phyo Min Thein upon coming into office. Three of which, in order of priority, was number one was electricity, number two being transportation, and third being housing. Now, these were three priorities that were taking place by Phyo Min Thein, but in the term alone, many projects have taken place under the most visible ones for the people are the Yangon bus system, affordable housing, NYDC, which is mostly in the press these days, and electricity is also one that is being felt by the people and experienced much more so than in the previous years. Drainage is one issue that keeps popping up every now and then. It seems that the YCDC and Yangon Region Government are taking this as a core issue. However, it keeps popping up every monsoon season, as we all know. And the last issue that still remains to be settled is, of course, the land issue of the question of ownership, squatters, and street vendors. As promised by Chief Minister Phyo Min Thein, the first project, the first priority by him was the electricity. Of course, this is a huge necessity in Myanmar. where the infrastructure is largely aging. So most of the cables and transmitting lines are very aging, and you'll see that Yangon, Myanmar, has one of the largest loss of electrical output through transmission in the region. The second for electricity is that it is the biggest improvement felt by the people since coming into office. You'll see that we have a lot less power out cuts these days than in the previous governments of before. But there's also a very big campaign promise by any government to supply electricity. We also expect electricity to be having an even bigger boost in the coming years because of the recent project with Japan and Eden Group for a $2 billion LNG, liquid natural gas power plant that is to be set up in the coming years. A few facts more on electrical consumption is that the total output in 2018 was around a little bit over 3,300 megawatts, 46% of which was consumed by Yangon. Now, many of this consumption, seeing as Yangon region consumes more electricity than than any other region in Myanmar, I think it's fair to assume that, and according to many experts' estimates, in the next 1 or 2 years, Yangon is expected to double its current 1,548 megawatts usage into something around 3,000. So practically, since 2018 and to 2021 and 2022, Yangon is expected to double its demand in the coming years. Now, there is also a 15% increase in demand nationwide per year. That has been the trend for the past several years. Only 44% of the entire country is currently connected to the electrical grid and is receiving power. So, there is quite a number of demand that is to be seen in the coming years. Around 1.3 out of 1.58 million households in Yangon are currently connected. So even in Yangon, that number of 46% is expected to increase much more so in the coming years. The other downside of addressing the need for electricity is that for every additional megawatt, around 1 billion jets is expected to be needed. So if the consumption is growing at a 15%, or the demand is growing at a 15% rate, then that places quite a lot of onus on the government for much more investment in electricity. Transportation, which is the second priority of Chief Minister Phyomin Thein, has largely seen several improvements. Number one, with the bus schedules. So now we have different schedules than before, and the routes are also different. But there are also some downsides. Number one, mainly being the YBS financial scandal that many of you will have seen with a bank regarding unclarity between finances. So that is one area where we'll have to pay quite close attention to that. The recent launch of the Yangon payment system, the YPS system, which is a card-based payment system for YBS buses, is also taking place. And so we'll have to see the outcomes of this, but we'll also have to make sure that the financial problems do not contract themselves into this YPS. But largely what is missing from the transportation sector is a clear policy. Now, the policy right now is that we are not very sure. We don't know whether we are going to a car-free or a less car-reliant city with a heavy focus on public transportation, and at the same time, while we're focusing on increasing and improving the YBS system, we're also seeing the sale of cars and unclear policies on that side. Now, knowing that this conflicts also with several investment opportunities, specifically, if you're the likes of Suzuki, which has an assembly plant in Yangon region, then you are allowed to have a Yangon number plate. However, if you are of a different manufacturer with no assembly plant in Yangon, then you are barred from having Yangon region plates, and you are only able to have a Bago or Naypyidaw or Shan State region plate. Now, that changes again for higher and more expensive cars because of the tax procedures. And so what we really need in Yangon is a very clear policy for transportation that will guide the development of the city. And alongside this clear policy, we also need to drastically improve the drainage system of the city. Otherwise, the road conditions are being destroyed every monsoon season, and that impedes the transportation system as a whole. Alongside transportation policies, we also need a transit-oriented development so that the sector can improve, and so that the government has a much more coherent development policy alongside it. This is a very interesting figure that is provided until 2017, and you'll see that the sale of cars have peaked around 2011 and 2012 when the import relaxation laws were relaxed, and that number has grown exponentially to what it is today. Now, many of you people in Yangon will have also experienced this personally, so there's no need to go so much more detail into this, but the lack of control and the lack of a clear policy is very disturbing given this data, because as we all know, Yangon suffers from much more heavy traffic today than it used to before. This is not just for cars, this is also the same for motorcycles beyond Yangon Center, beyond the Yangon Center. In the peripheral areas, you'll see that, of course, this data is across several years, about 40 years of data. And so you'll see that in the years around 2002 until 2008, these were the years under which motorcycles were banned in the city. And so we have this slump. But other than that, it has also quite skyrocketed in the outskirts of the city as the outskirt and peripheral areas have developed. Housing, the last priority stated by Chief Minister Phyo Min-thein, suffers from quite a number of things. Number one is, of course, the speculation of buyers, where buyers will speculate and they will invest in housing, where much more so than in gold or even in banking. Now, this has been quite the trend in Myanmar for a number of years. The second problem with housing is that the lack of affordability and accessibility to this affordable housing. Housing tends to be quite expensive, especially in the central business districts, including the young YCDC areas. And the problem of low-cost housing is that the low-cost housing itself does not have enough seed capital to truly take off. Low-cost housing tends to be built abruptly and tends to be built carelessly, and so there's not enough seed capital to really take care of low-cost housing. Housing also suffers from mixity, which is a social policy that we see in other developing countries to really take ahead and mix both socioeconomic levels of both, whether you're talking about different ethnic backgrounds and language backgrounds and religious backgrounds, but also mixity really helps with the socioeconomic ladder for people. Housing, as we all know, is also one issue that we can tackle in TOD by looking at transit-oriented development and building housing alongside transit hubs so that people who are living in these housings do not have to rely on their personal cars and they can actually have access to transit. Long-term maintenance is also one problem where you'll see a lot of housing projects, even higher-end housing projects, go into chaos after a few years and go into neglect after a few years because of a lack of long-term maintenance and planning. As we continue, we'll also see that the population statistics for the density is one of the most interesting, looking at development when we are talking about the future development of the city. Yangon, as we call it, is limited to this red box in the middle, and so this is the most dense area. And so when we think of future development, we often have to think of the available land in the region. And we see right now that development has taken shape in the last 5 years towards the east, largely because of easier access and much more bridges towards that Tageta and Dalian and North Kulaba and Gomyodit areas. Now, this is going to be true for the next 5 years as well, because land and access to the left or the west side of the city towards Lantaya is limited to just 2 bridges right now. Now, we don't know that if more bridges are to be planned or if more connectivity, such as the bridge built to be proposed by the Koreans towards Dala, is going to take shape. Now, if that does take shape, of course, we'll see a much more equitable access to other parts of Yangon city and beyond. But right now, Yangon city is indeed growing upwards and eastwards. That has mainly been the case in the last 5 years. And if you look at the population densities to this day, you'll also see that the townships of Yangon, South Oglapa, and Dinganjon are growing exponentially, much more so, and are also growing socioeconomically better than other townships. This is because many of the buyers and many of the residents in these townships have access to large roads, large main roads that give them connectivity to the center of the city. And so they're able to drive, and many of the residents in these townships are also car owners themselves. Now, we'll have probably some questions that why are people in Yangon and Takita not developing as much? Well, the answer is quite that in Yangon, many of the land area is unsuitable for development, or they are taken up by other ministerial lands, such as Ministry of Defense, which of course has quite a large number of presence in Yangon, especially also because of the airport in Yangon. And Takita is for the reason that Takita is a bit more industrial, and the connections towards Takita is limited to bridges. Now, as the title of this presentation is on the, Yangon's urban infrastructure in next years and looking at the upcoming elections, the future plans of the country, of the city, is that number one is the most important, and that is due to take shape, is a ring road that is typical of ring roads that we see in other cities. And we see a outer ring road that is to be built that encompasses the entire city as we know as such, going alongside Parmi Road all the way towards Loga that we see today. The inner ring road that we see that is circling the city is to be built around the existing Strand Road and outwards as well. And then, of course, we have many smaller link roads in the city center, and four key bridge projects that are being proposed to connect the city outwards, especially to the southern sides of the city. Another development potential that we see clearly that is being proposed is part of the development works that is ongoing right now for the Hantawadi and Bago connectivity that is along the Yangon-Mandalay Highway. This is also one of the sites where the Korean industrial complex is to be set up along here. You'll see, of course, that the city is expected to expand outwards and a little bit to the north. And then you have, of course, industrial projects that are taking place around Thilawa in the south. And this project is part of the New Yangon development, but also part of the Chinese BRI to set up a deep sea port in the very south of Yangon region towards the open seas. These are projects that are sure to be developed, and so we can expect a lot of development along these areas marked on this map. Speaking of the Chinese BRI Belt and Road initiatives, we see part of the connection to the CMEC, the Chinese Myanmar Economic Corridor, along the map displayed as such, where the main road to Chaopiu for the deep sea port is to be built, but also a inverted Y is to be built towards Yangon and connecting itself to both Thilawa as well as the previous deep sea port at the open seas. This will also pass towards to Mandalay, so the converging point for CMEC is indeed Mandalay, it is not Yangon. However, because of the population and the economic activity of Yangon, there is quite a lot of interest to tap into Yangon alongside the CMEC as well. Speaking of some of the challenges in the upcoming years, I'd like to give a few words just in closing in saying that the biggest issue that we see in Yangon, like in other regions of the country, is by far the question of land ownership. Land ownership is a key problem in the country that needs to be solved in order for successful development models to pursue after it. And the second is a lack of vision and strategic plan. Now, we don't clearly have, apart from the 2040 Yangon Master Plan, our Chief Minister and our country leaders have not yet set out a strategic plan that builds on a vision. Now, public transportation, as I said, also is a sector that still suffers from challenges because of the problems in finance as well as management. The infrastructure for utilities is also one that needs to be developed quite fast. Now, this includes both drainage to electricity, but the utilities part of, including waste management, is one that continues to be an immediate need that has not yet been addressed. Alongside these other challenges, COVID-19 is, of course, the most recent challenge that has taken place in Yangon. And speaking a little bit about these shortcomings, one of the first problems that we see is a lack of accessibility to clean water. Now, this is very much obvious because most of the audience listening today will have received large 20-liter bottles of drinking water to their houses at some point. This lack of clean water also plagues wet markets, where markets are not upgraded necessarily, because even though the market might be upgraded infrastructurally, a lack of clean water makes it quite hard and quite unhygienic during the case of COVID. Buses are also one system of public transportation that needs to be addressed during COVID-19 and the months that follow, because a lack of frequency means that there is quite a lot of congestion in the buses, leading to possible problems. Donor funds, as we all know, Myanmar is quite well known for donor funds and donations. However, a lack of spreading of these donor funds towards small businesses mean that donor funds usually get to concentrated areas of developed businesses, and so smaller players get weaned out over the long run. There is also a problem of rent freezing, where rent is not controlled by any government entity, and so a lot of the landowners, especially landlords, are able to manipulate rent as they see fit during a pandemic as such. And so this is one problem that also needs to be addressed successfully. Mobile payments have taken off quite a bit in the previous years, but in COVID-19, this is much more important than including, waiting times at government offices to pay bills, but also for a more cashless society, where if we were using much more mobile payments, then the risk of infection and spread of COVID-19 and other diseases would be minimized if we were to be using mobile monies. Speaking of a development vision, this is my suggestion of a development vision for Yangon, and I'll try to keep the 45 minutes that I'm allotted to a good time. First development vision that I would like to propose for our audience listening here today is to make Yangon much more walkable, so that it becomes more compact. Now, to make things walkable, we also need to promote public transportation, including the existing ones of YBS, and to allow alternative transportation such as biking. Now, biking is one area that we have not addressed in Yangon successfully, but we are starting to see some measures going forward. Some of the other measures is also to have a consideration for whether we are to be pro-car or anti-car. Now, looking at this is not an easy decision to make, and this will require a much more long-term plan, but I believe this is one suggestion that a lot of other successful cities around the world are starting to take shape, including in the central business areas. We are having much more public and walking transportation modes made available in the center areas, and cars are to be limited to the outskirts. We also would like to, need to have a careful look at some green policies to make Yangon truly sustainable, because even when thinking of energy, of electricity, for example, if Yangon is consuming more than half of the entire country's electrical output, this is not sustainable in the long run. And so we'll have to think of ways of conserving energy, both electrical, but also looking at the rain and waters and the use of water, especially with groundwater extraction being rampant in the city. The water table of the city has really lowered, and so we'll have to be thinking of sustainable policies alongside, whether it be looking at planting trees, etc. The design language in Myanmar, in Yangon, has also been quite uncontrolled. And so you'll see a lot of new buildings that are copy-pasting styles that we see from the likes of New York and Hong Kong, but we don't really have a Yangon feeling to the design language. Many of you, especially in the social sectors, will have complained that Yangon, the future developers, need to adopt a design language that is both an homage to the heritage, but also in line with the natural environment. A lot of the glass towers that we see today are simply not sustainable. And not only that, many of the housing projects that have taken place also, as previously discussed, need to be much more made affordable to looking at the real purchasing power of the people, and to look at other social measures such as mixity and rent control. Street life is one area where Yangon is quite known for, and especially even with Chief Minister Pyo Min-tain's plan to start a Yangon night market alongside the Strand Road. Street life is one area that we will need to promote alongside housing and walkability. And with walkability, we also are looking at small and medium enterprises being promoted on the street. Many larger developers and real estate agencies have also complained that Yangon suffers from a lack of a clear business district. Now, we don't know whether this business district to this day means just downtown, or if it actually is starting to shift uptown towards Gabai A, where a lot of the new offices and buildings are being built. But we also have a designated secondary business district alongside Mindama Street in the northwest, and so there is a lack of clear business zoning as well as industrial zoning. We're seeing industrial zones being developed on all corners, whether it be Tilawa on the east or on the west in Langdaya, or on the north that is being planned, such as the Korean Myanmar Industrial Complex. I'll stop here for Q&A. I think I am right on time on my 45-minute allocations, so I'll look at the Q&As that have been submitted. I see 5 that are submitted.
Thank you, Alex. In order to help with Q&A, I'll help by asking a few questions, if that's okay, on behalf of the audience. Everybody, please do keep your Q&A coming in. It's very important that you use this opportunity. We have around 15 minutes to talk about a very interesting presentation and some really difficult tasks that are facing Yangon. Not alone, many cities across the world face similar challenges. So I'd just like to maybe ask, in the past, Singapore has been considered as quite a good role model for city development and country development, but it is quite an advanced city. Is that a city that Yangon should look to, or are there other cities in Asia or indeed globally which Yangon could have a look at and see how it could equally model and work?
Thank you. That's a fair question that is being considered by a lot of people especially in the urban sector. We see Singapore being referenced time and time again. Now, there's many considerations to be made, of course. The first of which is to be having a public conversation around the type of model city that we would like. Now, when I mention my development visions and suggestions for a city that is much more heavy on public transportation, walkable, and less cars, that is my suggestion only. A lot of the conversations that will need to be had are to be had, for example, by our elected representatives on looking at what type of transportation modes we will be looking to encourage. This also needs to go alongside much more complex questions such as investment, when we are trying to attract investment for automobile makers. And so we'll have to be answering those questions on a much more public discussion. Right now, I don't know if we want to be Singapore. We mentioned Singapore because we see that as a success model, but we don't know if we can actually replicate those, and we don't actually know if we want to replicate those as well. I have one question here that is quite excellent being submitted from David Frederick. which I'll answer live, who mentions that the reference to bicycles for inner city transport is quite important, but that it's ironic that cities such as Paris, London, and New York are encouraging biking, whereas private car use is discouraged. Can't Yangon become a model for the use of battery and electric assisted bicycles, and that this would actually provide employment for smaller businesses that are making bicycles and improving, and workshops and such? That's a very valid question. Again, David, it can, and that again needs to be a discussion by elected representatives on whether we are to be, whether we are, when somebody needs to go and convince them of the benefits of bicycling and alternative transportation, and that needs to happen from the people. I mean, there are no lobbies from bicycle manufacturers in the moment. There are much more lobbies from car manufacturers, and so a lot of the discussion that needs to take place for these strategic decisions need to be taken place by the people firstly.
Okay, there's another couple more questions coming in. Tell us about the new Yangon city. What's your thoughts, and when is that likely to be around?
New Yangon is quite a contentious project. The first of which, my thoughts, is that the financial part of New Yangon needs to be very much made clear. We see this company up and running, and we don't know where the funds are coming from for all the staff for New Yangon right now. We also have a severe lack of communication with the population and with the media, despite the many town halls that have taken place. And most of which is that we don't actually know who has validated the strategic plan for the development. We don't know what sort of city it is supposed to become. It is supposed to be a luxury development. Do we actually have such a market for such luxury buyers? Is it going to be, why does this New Yangon need to happen urgently? Do we not have housing needs and other needs that are to be addressed in the city? Now, these are some of the thoughts that I have for New Yangon, but whether or not this city project will take place is also being pushed, as we all know, by the foreign interests of China, when New Yangon was one of the most important topics that was discussed when President Xi Jinping visited Myanmar. And so we'll see whether this project, what form it takes shape in the coming years. But right now, some very valid concerns, I believe, are only to be shared for the moment.
Sure, thank you. And that's looking at the future with that. But there are some specific challenges around right now. We talk about the population growth of Yangon itself, the doubling. And do you think the city has enough readiness for that to happen?
Quite frankly, no. We are struggling actually with the population that we have now, which is one of the reasons why we have squatters or informal settlements that we say in some communities. But the transportation sector is one area where we'll see people who are having inadequate modes of transportation, which is why we see motorcycles encroaching onto some roads in some areas. We'll see a lack of housing, that is displayed by squatters, quite frankly, everywhere, and the inability of the YCDC to really clear them out. There's no such clearing; they'll return because of a lack of housing. Lack of housing is also indicative of this lack of clear land ownership policies, where land ownership is still unclear. And so even with the population that we have today, we are quite struggling. And I think that sense of urgency actually needs to be felt by our policymakers, because most of the people that are on this call, for example, will not know about the problems of these people face today, because we are quite in the city center, and in our lives we feel untouched. But in the real lives of the peripheral areas, especially, those issues are very important. And so the population growth that is expected to double, even in the city center, I mean, we have a huge lack of housing for start. People will know that because housing tends to be quite expensive here. So that is just indicative of one of the problems that we will face.
And one of the challenges is, as you quite rightly pointed out, electricity and electrification, and particularly even in Yangon as that population grows. Now, a lot of people talk about sustainable electric, and we know that sustainable and long-term electric plans are important, but how do we manage to get the base level of the electricity infrastructure up to support the needs now, and then move on from there to more sustainable types of power? What's your views on how that can be coordinated into the plan?
Sure. I mean, from an urban standpoint, I think consumption needs, there are many areas where consumption can be cut quite successfully. Electricity tariffs in the city, of course, has been slowly lifted, slowly increased over the years, but it's still quite a cheap way for electricity for most people. The problem is that when electricity tariffs are increased, the base price is increased. And so, you'll see that sort of policy hurts the small and medium businesses, as well as, less privileged households rather than the privileged households. And so what we need is a larger exponential increase between the tiers. What I'm proposing is, for example, that a household of 4 to 5 be below a certain consumption rate. That rate can be quite cheap, but for industrial use, especially if you're looking at businesses in the city, that electricity tariff needs to come up. I mean, we need to make it a point so that hotels and shopping malls don't keep their doors open while having freezing air conditioning inside. That's just one of the ways in which we can address it. But much more than that is also looking at the design language to really have some way of calculating the environmental impact of new projects. Why are we building glass towers that are essentially greenhouses that have to be pumped full of air conditioning for anyone to live comfortably? Why are we not looking at the natural design language to actually encourage some sort of this cohabitation alongside our nature? We're trying to change our nature into something that is copy-paste from a model that is not from us. We're looking at models across developed countries, but much colder developed countries, none of which are in the tropical regions. And so, some of these questions of consumption and demand can be addressed. But going forwards, if your question is around the sustainable production of electricity itself, fairly easy. I mean, solar and wind energies are two sources that is being explored, especially in the mini grids that are not connected to the central national grid. Now, most villages will have started developing mini grids, and there are many NGOs that are working on this issue. But the grid system needs to start thinking of projects that include larger solar production capacities.
Okay, and as you'd expect with the audience that we have on today, there are some very technical questions as well. People wanting to ask specifically about spatial planning policy, current and future, that supports the implementation of the various TODs. Do you know of how much planning policy is in the system to address this?
Well, we are seeing quite a shift towards TOD, especially with the Yangon Circular Railway. Now, that is not because of a desire, but rather because of a need. The answer is quite simple, because the Yangon Railway, railways don't come cheap, and so when we're thinking of renovating an entire circular railway network, we need quite a lot of money, and for that to happen, TOD is one of the solutions that is being proposed by the likes of JICA, and of course the Japanese are quite known for their rail development systems, and we're also looking at from cities where you'll see quite famously that Bangkok is a city known for TOD. The Bangkok SkyTrain is directly connected to TOD centers, and so we're thinking of these models, but there is still a lack of policy around the guidance of TOD. does TOD mean that, you know, if we are to be making a, let's say we're making an upgrade to the Yangon Circular Railway, are we going to see shopping malls at every stop? Do we want shopping malls at every stop? Are we going to see commercial centers? Are we going to see housings? Are we going to, what sort of, are we going to have stops where, in fact, you get out of the station, there's actually, we don't know about these places. And so this TOD needs to actually also address what sort of development we actually want alongside these transit centers.
Okay, understood. There's a lot of questions actually relating to environmental. A number of them are coming through with slightly different views, but we're looking at questions saying, well, there's a unique climate of Yangon. What regulations or strategic measures are being addressed for nature conservation, bioclimatic design to help the metro region of Yangon? So really, what is happening in terms of the strategic measures around this? And maybe you could expand also into your thoughts on air and water pollution, and maybe even control of waste collection.
Sure. Right now, there are no design requirements really in addressing, you know, environmental measures. However, the building code is currently being improved to not just require the existing, you know, EIA and SIAs that everybody already knows about, but also a TIA, which is a transportation impact assessment. So of course, the EIA is the environmental impact assessment, and the SIA is the social impact assessment. And so we have the new TIA, but looking even at the EIA, the environmental impact assessment, we're seeing building being improved to require a certain area of green space, especially in larger projects. So for example, we're looking at groundwater penetration of rain, so that, you know, not all the entire project is just covered in concrete. We're actually looking to rehydrate the soil naturally through rainwater. So we'll need some areas where you'll have a little bit of green areas where rainwater penetrate into the soil. So that is one measure that is being considered right now. It's not really yet imposed or obliged, so that needs to take place in the coming years. But on the environmental impact assessment as well, we are also the Yangon government is also looking at ways to actually require developers to replant the same number of trees that they cut down elsewhere, or to repurpose them in part of the project. So, you know, whether you're having them on the roof or whether you're having them next to a patio area, those measures are being addressed. But those, to me, are just little drops in the ocean. The consumption of electricity and really the rampant use of air conditioning is one that needs to be addressed the most. You know, we're looking at trees, but we're not looking at air conditioning. I think air conditioning is one which, and it is a problem not unique to Yangon. It is a problem, you know, across Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is in itself a region known for, you know, development equals air conditioning. So that's one area that we'll have to look at.
Yes, so thank you on that. I notice we're quite close to the time limit we set for this, and there are many questions, so apologies that we were not able to address all of them. But there is another one I would just like to cover on transportation. There's a few people talking about the challenges of transportation, and not only just buses, but could we be looking at electrification of vehicles and other things? So what's your view as to where Yangon is in that process of being able to have a fully integrated and joined up transportation policy?
One of the first things that need to happen is that the Yangon Region Transit Authority, the YRTA, that is in charge of the transportation, the public transportation side in Yangon, is currently led by, well, politicians with too many jobs. And the suggestion in the community has long been to actually encourage technical experts to be part of this YRTA governing body. The problem with that is that you know, when technocrats are being pushed out in favor of other politicians that have far too many other commitments, I think the YRTA has fallen short into mismanagement. I think the management of YRT would be better suited if it was in the hands of technocrats instead. Now, technocrats can be from different backgrounds, of course, whether you're scholars or researchers or practitioners themselves. The other part to improving the public transportation is also has to come hand in hand with the other policies regarding transportation. Now, as I already mentioned, it has to come hand in hand with measures looking at the car use and the purchasing of cars, and especially if you're looking at number plates, for example, whether we're going to have Yangon region number plates or not, if we're going to limit Yangon region number plates or not, specifically even if there is investment. And so I think transportation is one issue that people need to decide whether we're actually going to be able to handle all the cars that we're selling. Other than that, I mean, it's a pretty direct question of management.
Okay, interesting observations. And apologies, we have reached our time, and we do try to keep these webinars on time, to time. And so apologies if questions haven't been answered. We have a copy of the questions, and whatever we can answer and get back onto our website, we will do. But one final question I think would be useful for us. Given the nature of the audience, the Myanmar, Hong Kong chambers and the Hong Kong businesses, particularly as developers, what sort of advice would you give to Hong Kong-based developers who are looking at Yangon to either invest or to support the infrastructure changes? What would be your giving advice as we leave the webinar?
I think for people who are already in Yangon, that would be, there is no shortage of advice. I think people who are already in Yangon and present with chambers such as the Myanmar Hong Kong Chamber can give you a lot more. But for people who are looking at starting to becoming a stakeholder in Yangon, especially as either a property developer or investor in other projects, I think the main thing to watch for is what it is to look for is to ask for the government's clear policy. Now, as a foreign chamber, I think the people who are here are very well positioned to actually demand that the new upcoming elections will also bring about a new vision for Yangon. When we look at the new chief minister, what are going to be the priorities of this chief minister? How is he planning to execute on this? Now, when we look at for all investors from Hong Kong, I think this is quite valid, because then without clear designation of things such as a designated business district, how do you know where the area that you are building up is actually going to be in line with the government policy? If you're building up an area that is going to be overlooked by the government in a short number of years, how is that going to be beneficial to yourself as a business person or to the residents of Yangon? And that has largely been the case. From what I understand, the construction of Maga real estate project, the central in Gabae, has actually been quite beneficial, because that goes alongside the development that is taking place in that area. If the project was to be built in the original area, which was next to the zoo, I don't actually know if it would have been to the benefit of the city. That might have been an area that is easily going to be overlooked. Now, when it's on Gabae, that project is actually alongside other projects that are attracting business and attracting customers, and so that becomes a little hub of its own. And so, having the knowledge and strategic vision for plans is essential, I think, for foreign investors to know from the Yangon government. And so that is one thing that I would like to give away from today.
Alex and Khant, thank you very much for your time. We have overrun slightly. I know there's a lot more questions. I would also point out that the urban and regional planning law has been submitted to Parliament and can be available if people wish to have a look. Lots of information is available through either the chambers or indeed feel free to connect directly with Alex. I'm sure he'd welcome to connect with developers who are looking at Yangon specifically. Yangon is not unique in the world. Everybody's facing very similar challenges in how to urbanize, how to sustain, how to get a lot of these developments to work hand in hand and closely together. But it's a great opportunity for people to think about the broader elements and aspects of the critical infrastructure that is required and the challenges that are faced by us. So thank you very much for your time and all your questions. As I say, thank you all for your participation. This is part of a series of webinars that we are introducing that are to give you an idea of how to prepare your business for Myanmar's future in 2021 and beyond. So we're actually trying to look beyond the COVID situation, beyond the elections, to be business ready and in good. So the next program that we have will be around energy revolution, which will sit hand in glove with today's presentation, where we've got speakers who will be talking about what's going to happen in Myanmar's energy revolution. And as from the slide pack you saw today, that will be a very interesting conversation given the power requirements that face Yangon and the rest of Myanmar. We will then have further updates on banking and finance industries and others in terms of building better business integrity in Myanmar into September. So please look out for those on our website. We are trying to package them so that you get a little bit of new learning each time you come. And hopefully that will be beneficial for you to think about what investments could come into Myanmar. Alternatively, if you are already here, some of the challenges that are being faced, and we do that in a very candid way. So once again, finally, thanks again to our speaker, Alex Khant, and thank you for your candid responses, your views on various things, and your presentation, which we will make available through our website. Okay, everybody, thank you for your time. Enjoy your weekend ahead, and hope you have a relaxing and positive time. Thank you all.
Thank you.